Study of anti-Semitism. And we were in New York last night to kick off the conference, and I think we started off with a very good evening. The issues that we discussed in general, just to sum up very quickly, is how the issues of the domestic situation in Iran with regard to human rights and some of the issues that are taking place within Iranian society, how's that affecting external relations vis-a-vis Iran in the region and internationally. And from the speakers last night, Mrs. Carr was speaking about the domestic situation, the political situation in Iran and human rights in the region. Erwin Kotler also spoke about incitement to genocide from a legal perspective. And Professor Menashri also spoke about the domestic situation in Iran and the need for reform. And as Professor Menashri said, there's two trains leaving the station. One is of social reform, and the other is of the nuclear program and the nuclear weapons program of the current government, the current regime, and how these issues are very worrying and ties into the mandate, obviously, of a research center doing work on anti-Semitism, but not just on anti-Semitism, notions of otherness, the role of minorities in society. So this is an area that has profound implications for Iranians and Iranian society internally, and also it has profound implications with regard to the region, and certainly vis-a-vis the situation with Israel. Israel, after all, is the only country in the Middle East in which non-Muslims have gained self-control or have gained self-determination on land in the Middle East. And with a regime that has certainly, to say the least, difficulties of accepting the other or accepting difference, this is perhaps a deep ideological issue in question with profound implications. So today we have the privilege of having really leading experts from various fields, from the sort of sociology and the domestic human rights situation within Iran. We have people who are internationally known experts on strategic and ideological issues, and we also have some leading legal scholars to look at the implications of these questions. So I welcome you, and it's an honor to have the speakers, an honor to have those of you who are interested here with us today. There's going to be a small change in the program. So we're starting late, but we'll sort of open things up a bit. Professor Menashri will go at the last session because we had a cancellation. Professor Halberstrom will not be here, so we'll sort of free up this space this morning to deal with the question of the Iranian regime and human rights. So the first speaker will be Professor Hooshang Amirahmadi, who's a professor of urban planning and policy development at Rutgers University. He's also the director of the Center for Middle East Studies at Rutgers. And Professor Amirahmadi, is also the founder and president of the American Iranian Council and the founder of the Center for Iranian Research and Analysis and a president of the Caspian Association. So he's well-versed in these issues. And sitting next to him is Mrs. Carr. Mrs. Carr is, those who were here with us last night, I refer to her as a hero of human rights, and Professor Erwin Kotler also echoed those sentiments. So Mrs. Carr is a leading human rights advocate in Iranian society and a women's rights activist and advocate. In 2001, she was convicted for charges acting against national security and disseminating propaganda against the Islamic regime. She was a Radcliffe Fellow at Harvard University and was based at the Carr Center for Human Rights Policy at Harvard's John Kennedy School of Government. In 2002, she received the National Endowment for Democracy Award presented by Laura Bush. So it's really an honor to have you both here. And also joining is Andrew Apostolou. He's a senior program manager for Iran at the Freedom House. Freedom House is an independent, non-governmental organization that supports the expansion of notions of freedom in the world. So starting off, Professor Amirahmadi will speak on issues of Iran power structure and implications for democratic change.
Thank you, Mr. Mahdi. It's a pleasure to speak at this very distinguished panel, and good morning. After 10 years, 2 months ago, I went back to Iran, took a close look at the country for a month. And those of you who follow the Persian story of my trip to Iran, it's very fascinating, although I was not invited, I shouldn't say invited, although I was sponsored for the trip by the Iran's president. The right wing in the country made a mess out of that very process. The Khan actually still continues to question the government's sponsorship of that trip, and basically argues that Hooshang is a spy of the US, and that he also is a person that is trying to overthrow the regime, and a person of that nature should not be in the country. Well, obviously, I'm neither a spy nor I'm after regime change. I've never been. I don't believe in regime change. I don't believe in spying. I think we all are, in a way, in one way or another, spy, because we academics talk, and we go and do research and write and let the other people know. Except that our business is a completely different business, a legitimate business, and we are the conscious of the societies that we come from or we work with. With that introduction, I just want to put you at rest regarding who I am and what it is that I have been doing here or back in Europe. The subject of today's talk is the power structure of the country, Iran that is, and the implications for change, democratic change that is. And also I will add to that power structure stuff a little bit about my observation and where that Iran could go in the near future if status quo was to be maintained in terms of the relation with the US and Israel and so on. The structure of power in Iran is a subject that most of you probably realize is very understudied. Many of us has, over the last the last 30 years, focused on Islam and Iran's foreign policy. These have been the two key subjects. And then the third added to that was obviously the issues of human rights and democracy and so on. But one thing that we haven't done work on, particularly in some detail, is how the system is structured, and who speaks for what, and who really, what are the relationships, what are the networks. The first point I wanted to make is this, that Iran does have a power structure, and that's very important. Iran is very different from many of the Arab countries who don't even have a power structure. That is a structure of power that you could say who is who in the country, whether that is working or not is different. For example, go to Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Bahrain, or any of the other states in the region, you hardly find a structure of power in place. That is not the case with Iran. Iran does have a power structure in place. That power structure is in place in two ways. One, of course, Iran has a constitution that defines in some detail who is who and what are to be done by whom. That constitution has been obviously changed at least twice, but the bottom line remains that constitution includes a set of what I call formal institutions, legal formal institutions that are elected and unelected. The formal legal institutions that are elected, like for example the presidency, the parliament, the assembly of experts, is right all in place in the constitution. Now, the institutions that are unelected are also in place in the constitution. the House of Leadership, the Bali of Faqih, okay, which is indirectly elected, but is not directly elected by the people, and the Guardian Council, for example, the Expediency Council, and some of the other very powerful institutions. Now, aside from this formal, that is the formal elected and unelected institutions, you also have next to it another set of institutions that I call real and unreal, or you could say real powers and sort of like hidden powers. Real power and what that means is that there are power out there that necessarily do not correspond to the formal structure of the power, based on individuals, certain institutions, some we know about, others we don't know. So you always have to think in terms of a country that has a power structure built into the institution, in the constitution, but also another parallel, sort of like a hidden, non-written constitution, if you will, that includes other powers that at times do correspond, but also most of the time do not even correspond with the way the Constitution has explained who should be doing what. So this is a very important thing to, the consideration to have in mind. Most of the time, for example, there are institutions, individuals that exercise powers that are not either in the Constitution or they are not supposed to have that power. Now, as just like any society, Iran is changing, but at the same time remaining sort of like continuing. So the continuity and change is a good thing in Iran. But the key issue here to understand is the following. From the very first day that Islamic Republic was put together, and the first day that the Constitution was put together, there was one thing in the mind of the leaders of that revolution, that the people who wrote that Constitution, and that is, how do they reconcile Islam with democracy, or Islam with a popular will, religion and the popular, Islamic Republic? How do you bring Islam and the republicanism into one complex? The Constitution, from the beginning to the end, is a struggle over this relationship. That how do you maintain a theocracy that also gives people, a role to play? Well, obviously, Islam, religion, comes from the God, and certainly, according to the theocracy, cannot be subordinate to the people. People are always subordinate to the God. So, at the end of the day, the people would have to follow what the God would say. The religion would say, and its representative, which is the Bali of Tariq. In this particular case, the unelected officials. The key here is that unelected officials represent the Islamic side. Supposedly, the elected institutions represent the people's side. So there is this struggle between the people and Islam here, and that is the unelected and unelected. Elected representing people, the republic; unelected, okay, Islam representing the God, and so on. That struggle continues, and still they are trying to find a way to reconcile Islam and democracy. Well, the bottom line so far is that Islam may be compatible with some level of democracy, like maybe free elections, but it is certainly not compatible with liberal democracy. Liberal democracy. It is certainly not compatible with a lot of what human rights, Universal Declaration of Human Rights would dictate. So there is a problem out there. And I think this problem, in a way, is built into any religion. The problem in Iran is that religion is the government. So therefore, it's a struggle with the popular will is more at the practical level than at theoretical. It is not a theoretical issue in Iran as it is like today in Christianity or in Judaism. So it's something out there between people and their religion. The Iranian political structure is certainly not vertical. It is largely horizontal. It's a tree like a big trunk with a lot of branches, falling as a falling tree. And I call it a millipede. A millipede is just like with a trunk and then a lot of little feet around, feet here and there. So although the Wali Faqih is a little bit above, and it does have a head out there, but broadly speaking, the system is flat. And that is, there are so many centers of power, thousands of feet around, that each of which do have something to say. And therefore, it has become extremely difficult to coordinate among all these little centers. This comes directly from the nature of the Shia hierarchy itself. The Shia hierarchy is a flat hierarchy. There are patches of powers here and there, with this Ayatollah having this many people around him and that Ayatollah having that one around him, and then they could coordinate between themselves, but hardly one Ayatollah is very high above the other Ayatollahs. Now, this is very different from the structure that Iran had, the power structure that Iran had under the Shah. Under the Shah, you had a very, very vertical system of power structure. You had the Shah at the very, very top of the hierarchy, and then somehow everybody would fall down all the way to the bottom. So that is not the way Iran is now structured. The second thing is, in relation to this, is that in Iran, the power structure is built around functions as opposed to territory. That is to say, but in a federal system, in the US, for example, it is the territory, it's the state that is the unit of power. In Iran, it is the sectors, it is the functions, the ministries that are the unit of power within the system. That is, ministers are more important than governors are. And the power comes from the top in Tehran, through the villages, although even then, Tehran is powerful not because it is a big city or it is a capital city, but because it is the seat of all these ministers, all these functions. So it is the function, not territory, that defines Iran. And that's very important to understand, because this argument about the ethnic movements and so on misunderstand how Iran operates, in terms of the way the power is put together. Another important development in Iran to consider is that the Islamic Republic started as a system with what I call soft power. It was the legitimacy of the system. It was the revolutionary legitimacy, the religious legitimacy of the system that really was the base of the power, the source of the power. Over time, that legitimacy has largely been reduced and increasingly replaced by what I call hard power. And as a result of this change from a soft power to a hard power base, that is, you have changed, you see changes in two very important areas in Iran in terms of the power relations. Clergy versus the security military forces. Increasingly, from the very beginning, it was the clergy that was basically in command, let's put it that way. And it was clergy in command with legitimacy, with the soft power. Now, increasingly, as the hard power has become more important than the soft power for the regime, the clergy has been increasingly replaced by military security forces who understand the language of hard power more than the soft power to begin with. So the clergies are losing to non-clergies, and the civilian losing increasingly more to the military security people. Another development to watch is that the Islamic Republic as a theocracy has failed to produce theocrats. Generationally speaking, theocracy the Islamic theocracy has not produced the theocrats that would really make the system move forward. So you have a system, a theocracy without theocrat. And that's very important. Only few religious leaders have been produced. The rest are largely, if there is any, it would be in the military other areas. Another important development is because of all this, there is a diffusion of power. And here is the key concept that I wanted to share with you before I end. When we go to Iran, I went to Iran and looked very carefully to see what's really actually happening, bottom line. I saw this, that a society with a dynamic social base, a country that is moving forward, particularly in terms of the education of its young people, the aspiration of its young people, the expectation of its young people, as a country that really is facing a revolution of expectations, tremendous revolution of expectations. That, in one hand, in the people's side. But next to that is the power structure that I was speaking about, the political society, as opposed to the so-called civil society that is growing. And again, as civil society, I don't mean civil society in a traditional way, I mean the social base of the society, the people, and so on. But the political society, as opposed to the social base, has remained stagnant, largely stagnant. And therefore, you have a tremendous gap developing between the social base and the superstructure of power. And this cleavage has led to two important developments, and I think this is the future. One, the system increasingly to respond to this rising expectation have begun thinking in terms of what to do, and that thinking about what to do led to factionalism. You have got the reformists, you have the principalists, and then you have principalists number 1, 2, 3, 4, and then you have reformists number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, until 18. So you have a political society that is very much into pieces. And everybody in the political society thinks that it has a better, or he or she has a better idea how to resolve the problem. The problem is none of them do. And as a result, they have all failed to incorporate, to melt into themselves the social base. That is, the political society was trying to melt the social base into itself, has indeed failed, and the reverse is happening. And this is the key. That I believe that because of this factionalism and the inability, the mismanagement of the political society in dealing with the demands and expectations of the social base, that superstructure, that factions are being increasingly melted into the social base. So you have, I would suppose in the next 5, 10 years, if everything goes the way it is, you don't have any of these factions. Now, what is emerging is that as this factions melt into the social base, I believe a new reorganization of political society is emerging in the country. But this time, this reorganization is not based on religion, it's not based on factions, or whether I have a better Islam than you do, or so on. It is based on two ideas. One, a rejection of factionalism toward a concept of national sort of get together. The national, I don't mean nationalism, I mean sort of like non-factional. I mean the country as a whole, nationwide, that is to say. So one, you would see organizations develop that are increasingly nationwide in its scope. And this organization could be coalitions, there could be even parties. And second, I believe that this development will be centered around certain ideas. And I think the three ideas that are emerging in Iran of the future, of the next few years, that are very critical. One, relations with the outside world, US and Israel is the center of that problem. Second, democracy, but the bottom line in democracy or human rights really is free elections, free and fair elections, as opposed to democracy, human rights as general concepts. And finally, it is the economy. It is the economy, so there are, and of course an economy that will deal with the young people in terms of both job and reduction of poverty. So you have a country that is emerging, a polity that is emerging soon that will have a national agenda with a national power structure or structure of polity that will focus on these three issues. I believe economy will be the center of this new thinking, and then U.S. relation with the U.S. or outside, and the free elections will be seen as factors that will have to be resolved in favor of an economic sort of growth and reduction of poverty and increasing social welfare and so on. Now, if I am right that the power structure is building into the social base, and that the social base is rethinking itself in terms of the structure of the power and the new polity, if I am right that the national projects that the society is trying to define are relation with the U.S. and Israel, as well as the free elections and not democracy and human rights, I mean free elections, as well as the economy, I think the next stage in the struggle in Iran will be completely different from what we have so far seen. And I believe the leaders, political leaders and social leaders, academics, who will spend some time in reformulating or formulating this particular emerging trend, and coming with ideas about, for example, how to resolve U.S.-Iran relations, how to mitigate tension with Israel, how to bring about free elections as opposed to democracy, but just a first step in a long ladder, and then how to put the economy together. Those people are going to be governing that country. But then again, this all depends on if that society will continue in its peaceful path, and that it will not involve into any confrontation, military confrontation between, with the outside force, whoever the outside force is. I believe if that happens, if there was to be a military confrontation of any sort with Iran, I think not only all of this will go, I believe you will have almost everything that is in place will disappear. I believe the Islamic Republic will reorganize itself in a completely different way, and obviously, unfortunately, I will say in a way that none of us wish to see. Thank you very much.
Just to let you know, after the two other talks, we'll have time for question and answers. Mrs. Carr is going to speak on the human rights situation in Iran.
Hi everybody. Before I start, just one add 2 points to the lecture of Professor Amirahmadi. One is Vilayat al-Faqih, that now we are under this political system is just one reading of Shia. And there is no agreement between Shia clergies about this kind of political system. And the second is, that's correct. We do have 2 kinds of institutions in our government in Iran, elected and selected institutions. But unfortunately, I have to say, all elected institutions are under control by selected institutions. So we cannot say that we have access to some kind of democracy, not perfect democracy, even some kind of democracy. We cannot say that we do have in Iran and in this legal system. But something that is related with human rights, I have to say there are 2 obstacles. Our legal system, in theory, is not accepted human rights principles. And in practice, they don't mind about that. And they say, sometimes very clear, they say that we don't have human rights standards like human rights standards that are written in human rights international document. And when we criticize, for example, about stoning, somebody who is the head of the Human Rights Center in judiciary system, he says that that's not violation, that's punishment. And when something is punishment, it's not violation. So we are facing with this view in our legal system. And that's the reason if sometimes we do have some facilities or facilities in our legal system for promoting human rights, this kind of view, they stopped the judiciary system or some part of judiciary system to work on that. On Islamic Republic Constitution, you can find, I think, about 17 articles. 17 articles which are according human rights standards, but most of them, and I can say all of them except one, it's conditional. And when they say that freedom of speech is accepted, or freedom of gathering is accepted, or freedom for having independent political system is accepted, immediately you can find something in the article that is conditional. And in these articles they say if they do according Islamic or Sharia principles. But in our legal system, we don't have any clear definition of Islamic principle, of Sharia principle. And that's the reason anybody who come on power, they can work by these articles for their personal benefits or gang benefits or, I don't know, fractional benefits, and anyway, they don't mind about human rights, and human rights that this constitution is talking about that, but it's very conditional. So I want to explain that this legal system in theory and in practice cannot be according human rights principles. In theory, in our legal system, and in practice, because the view that I tried to explain about that to you, the people who have reading of Islam, and this reading is against human rights. Despite of that, Iranian government, they signed some very important international human rights documents, and they have to work according these international human rights documents. As a member of the United Nations, the Iranian government is obliged to follow rules and regulations created based on the international human rights law. The Iranian government has arrived at a positive vote for the ratified 1948 Human Rights Declaration, approving the contents of the human rights legislation. Therefore, the Iranian government has accepted the human rights law as interpreted by the declaration and the treaty. Many laws regarding women in Iranian laws and regarding non-Muslim in Iranian laws are not compatible with international standards. Accordingly, Iranian laws are not in accordance with the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, YIISA. Accordingly, Iranian laws are not in accordance with the International Covenant of Civil and Political Rights, ICCPR. The Civil and Political International Covenant of the 1966 was ratified by Iranian legislators. Accordingly, Iranian laws are not in accordance with the Convention on the Rights of the Child, CRC. The Convention on the Rights of the Child was ratified by Iranian legislators after the Islamic Revolution. In some ways, Article 9 of Iranian civil laws is in conformity with those segments of international clauses that are based on Iran's collaboration with other governments. Therefore, Iran's indifference to principles of international human rights and the repeated violations committed in the legislative and judiciary spheres, the fact that intra-laws requiring enforcement are not respected. Therefore, from the standpoint of a citizen, this government is a law breaker and thus cannot order its citizens to abide by the law. That's something that is very important, and the government of President Khatami, they were insisting on that rule of law, and they asked the government for that, but unfortunately, as you know, the radical people in that political system, they didn't tolerate, and reform was at end, and we couldn't get any other results from reform, and now we are facing with a political system that all parts of this political system is in the hand of very, very radical people. And somebody who are moderate, they are silent in this political system, and they don't have right to talk about something. Just something that is happening now is in Usul-Garayan. Usul-Garayan, it means very radical, revolutionary, and Muslim people who now are on power. Now something is beginning that I think it would be good for future of Iran. As you know, a big part of parliament now is in their hands, and now they are fighting with each other. Some part of them are supporting Ahmadinejad, and some part of them are opposing Ahmadinejad, and they are criticizing Ahmadinejad policy, especially in economic policy. And I think this is very important for future of political of Iran, because this is a very new thing. We are facing with some articles against human rights in Iran. These articles are against equality between men and women, equality between Muslim and non-Muslim, rights for dissidents, having rights for registered independent organization, the lack of permission for having independent political system, and most important thing is there is no freedom of speech. And that's something that is obstacle and most important obstacle for human rights activists and women's rights activists and civil society activists in Iran for talking and criticizing about the policy of government in internal policy and in foreign policy. Now something that is obstacle for promoting human rights in Iran and it's coming from outside is all media all over the world, they are focusing on nuclear and they don't focus on human rights situation in Iran. And this is something that I think some part of that government, they like that. Because they like nuclear would be on the center of attention of international community. And they don't like international community have sympathy with victims of human rights activists and women's rights activists and students of university in Iran. And this is something that is coming from international community. And something that is obstacle and is coming from international is because focusing on nuclear and because there is no normal relationship between Iran and United States. Anybody who wants to criticize the government, they accuse them as somebody who is spying for United States or who is working with United States to have military attack to Iran. And they accuse them as somebody who are working against national security. Even women's rights activists. What women's rights activists say? They say that, okay, we need something like right for divorce, equal right for divorce between men and women, equal rights for something like custody for children, and something like that. But they accuse them as somebody who are working against national interest, and sometimes they accuse them they are getting money from foreign countries, and they stop them and they condemn them. This is something that is coming from outside, and the government prefer international community focus on nuclear, and they like to take time and to kill time for that, and they don't like international community to get time for working to promote human rights in Iran or having pressure on Iran for promoting about women's rights and human rights in Iran. Flogging and prison sentences for women's rights activists is something that every day, if you follow the news of Iran, you can find that. Tortured students sentenced to prison, students of university, especially the last one, 3-1, who condemned to be in prison after many months. They've been in jail and they've been under torture, and after that they said that they had confession under pressure. This is something that is very new. And something that is very important is, according our legal system, attorney at law, they are very limited. And sometimes the judge can stop them for being with somebody who they arrest. And just they give them permission to be in the court, but not before the court. And that's why, and that's why that somebody who is arrested, by then they are very alone, and they can do everything, like torture, physically torture or psychological torture, and nobody is there, and there is no witness for that. And after they get all confession, and sometimes it's not true, after that, they send the case to the court, and they give permission that now you can hire a lawyer. And when lawyer and attorney comes to this case, everything is, everything is over. And that person said everything that probably is not true under pressure against himself, against herself, against other people. And the end of some case is showing in television, and they say that if I am talking about freedom, if I am talking about a legal moderation in this political system, everything is coming from the United States. And in television show, they say something like that. So in this situation, we cannot be hopeful with something better than this. Just now we are trying our best to go to all gatherings when they invite us and talk about human rights and women's rights in Iran, and ask people, please help us in this case. We know that nuclear is on the center of your attention, but something that is in the center of attention of Iranian people is a better economic situation and better human rights situation. Now, by this political system and legal system, we do have technical problems. As Professor Ahmadinejad, sorry, Amirahmadi, sorry about that, explained, we do have an institution in our legal system. The name is Guardian Council, and I think all of you know about Guardian Council. The role of Guardian Council is very dangerous for everything, and for human rights, for democracy, and for having freedom, having democratic freedom, having independent parliament. Just I explain these two roles, and I will leave the tribune. Guardian Council is an institution. 6 clergies, very important clergies, are appointed by Supreme Leader, and 6 juries are appointed by the head of judiciary system. And the head of judiciary system is appointed by Supreme Leader. So there is a 6. And this institution can reject anybody they want from candidature from parliament or to be president. This is one role that is against democratic election. We have to work and to make Guardian Council weak. I don't know how, but we are doing that since years ago, and I think that's good. That's good policy for human rights activists and democracy activists and even somebody who are working for better economic situation in Iran. Because now when we don't have democratic election, we cannot say that we do have our people in this parliament. So they cannot control the government, even in corruption, even in economic situation. And the second role that is very dangerous is they do have the right to veto all legislation that the Majlis Parliament passed. Just they say that this article is against Sharia, or this article is against Constitution. And you have to know that the only institution who has right to give us interpretation of Constitution and Sharia principle is Guardian Council. So we don't have any chance for any change in this political system without making weak Guardian Council. And now we are working for that, and I don't know what would be the result of that, and we invite everybody to support us in this policy. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. So Andrew Apostolou will speak now, and then once Andrew's finished, we can have a Q&A session. He's speaking on the state of civil society in Iran.
Well, thank you very much. And first of all, I'd like to say thank you to Charles Small and Lauren Clark for the organisation putting this together. I'm going to speak on the state of civil society in Iran. By civil society, I mean very simply the ability of citizens to organise freely and to associate freely and to express themselves in an unfettered manner. And at Freedom House, we try and assist Iranian civil society. I'm going to draw in this talk on the very good work that my colleagues in the Iran team at Freedom House Washington DC do, and also the analysis people in New York do. They put out 3 big reports. One is called Freedom of the Press, came out yesterday. The other one is Freedom in the World, it will come out in June. Then there's a report called Countries at Crossroads, and that will appear in autumn of 2009. And the scores, because people like to use Freedom House work for various economic analysis as well, the scores were actually published earlier in the year at the beginning. Now, as you probably know, the picture for civil society in Iran at the moment is rather bleak. We have a policy, I think, of state-led regression, and the state has multiple tactics to reverse what civil society development there has been in the past. However, rather than simply just say it's bleak and here's why, let me give you what I think is the counter-argument that is out there, and it's worth knowing what this is. There are people who would argue you can come to the opposite conclusion, that actually, despite 2.5 years of the presidency of Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, Iran still possesses the traits of a vibrant civil society, that there is still civil society development in Iran, that in some ways Iran is more developed than other Middle Eastern countries, although that's not saying terribly much. For example, women in Iran can vote, they're in parliament, they can drive cars. They can't do that in Saudi Arabia. You could also argue that in Iran, the results of elections are not strictly preordained. After all, in 1997, Khatami won a landslide victory despite clear evidence of massive ballot fraud against him. His supporters then swept the marginless in 2000. He was re-elected in 2001. During the early years of his presidency, thousands of non-governmental organisations opened their doors. So you could argue that there were very promising signs of civil society developing in Iran, and there might be a potential for democratic change, and that Iranians might be able to organise and choose their country's future. That's one argument that is made. Now, what I'd argue, however, is that that promise has not come to fruition, and that quite the contrary, the country's reactionary forces, and I think the word conservative is a little bit too mild in this context, successfully thwarted any possibility that these promising civil society elements could in any way coalesce. And what the reactionary forces, I think, have demonstrated repeatedly under Khatami is that they could keep civil society in Iran atomized and ineffectual. And one of the ways they did this, in addition to the usual legal harassment was outright violence, with gangs of state-encouraged vigilantes who murdered dissident intellectuals. And Michael Rubin, who's here today, did a very good publication for the Washington Institute on this, I think, overly obscure subject. It's something that really needs to be investigated much more. And since Ahmadinejad took the presidency in 2005, these reactionary forces, with some success, have actually superseded this strategy of harassment and division with a new strategy that actually seeks to reverse civil society development in Iran and to replace genuine civil society with an Islamic alternative. Now, so-called Islamic civil society has actually long been the vision, you could argue, of the ruling class of the Islamic Republic, and there's a very good article in the Journal of Democracy in October 2007 by Ladan Boroman, who argues that it's this vision of an Islamic civil society that Khatami himself was actually promoting. Under such an arrangement, what would happen would be that an NGO could exist if it was not deemed to be, in its activities and its aims, inconsistent with state ideology. I have a hunch that the likely preference of the ruling class would be that all NGOs would actually be government-organised NGOs, and the acronym for that, as you know, is GONGO, and some of the not very former Soviet republics have been very good at that. So if you interpret the current attack on civil society in Iran as being part of a fundamental regime proclivity towards a state-controlled and ideologically vetted notion of public association, then that, I think, explains what's happening in terms of the excuse that the state's come up with, which is that we have to do this because the Americans are supporting civil society. And that, as I said, is an excuse. It's not actually a compelling explanation. So let's just quickly look at what I mean by the state-led regression. Well, as you know, the fundamentals haven't changed. You know, women remain less than second-class citizens. All female candidates were barred from running for the Assembly of Experts elections in December 2006, along with anybody who couldn't pass a regime-imposed set of exams in Islamic law. I suspect the president might have failed those as well. We've also had the use of violence against demonstrations and to break up strikes, the imprisonment of the leader of the bus workers' union. There's continued use of revolutionary courts, which of course lack anything like due process to repress activists and people suspected of activism. Religious minorities remain discriminated against. There is still no Sunni mosque openly operating in Tehran. We have more Sunni mosques operating in Washington, D.C. The regime repeatedly intrudes into Iranians' private lives with so-called morality campaigns. In 2007, around 150,000 people were arrested, thousands were referred for trial, and thousands were forced to sign humiliating pledges to alter their behaviour. Now, you'll often see in the press and media that the morality campaigns are reported as basically being about, you know, closing down illegal parties, women covering the hair on their heads and this sort of thing. It's actually more than that. And as some of you may know, there have been instances in recent years of the regime executing gay men simply for being gay men. As for the elections, well, there was an apparent setback for Ahmadinejad in the 2006 municipal elections and the Assembly of Expert elections, but the regime has since managed to successfully manipulate the electoral process, and that manipulation is structural, it's part of the process. And so the result is that while, yes, reformists do compete in Iranian elections, they just don't compete on a level playing field. And by international standards, the Islamic Republic has never held anything remotely resembling free and fair elections. And in fact, that structure of control that is inherent to the electoral process in Iran has been augmented with a very interesting development in January 2007, which involves the Revolutionary Guards in the vetting process for elections. So we're not just talking about an Islamic regime here, we're talking about a regime with a military component now. Now let's just talk quickly about some of the tactics of repression that are used, and this is just a brief overview. Obviously, there's pseudo-legal harassment, there's censorship, and there's outright violence. And there's also the memory of previous violence, which is also always very important in these sorts of societies and these sorts of contexts. The fact that they may not be killing thousands of people at the moment, the fact that they did, and that it's not acknowledged, that memory is very important. So let me give you a few instances. Censorship, again, it's inherent in the system. The Ministry of Culture has to approve all publishing. There are some obvious taboo subjects, questioning religion, women's rights, anti-government activities, certain aspects of the nuclear issue. The Tehran Publishers Association recently complained about this, complained about the inconsistency and said that it's frequently seen that an issue that has resulted in a book being banned is abundant in another one that's published. So there's a system of censorship, but it's censorship that is inconsistent. I'll come in a minute to why it's inconsistent, because I think that vagueness is actually deliberate. It's one of the ways in which the regime keeps people off balance. There was a recent Harvard study on the internet, as you know, which looked at the way in which the blogosphere is not entirely closed down if it's reformist. Well, that could be to a degree of inefficiency and dysfunction. I mean, it happens. But it's also a way, as I said, of keeping people on their toes. To give you an idea of the vagueness, which means that you just don't know where the red line is in Iran. Article 500 of the Penal Code provides for anyone who undertakes any form of propaganda, a term that's undefined, against the state will be sentenced to between 3 months and 1 year in prison. What on earth does that mean? Another good example is Article 513, which criminalizes an insult to religion. How do you define an insult to religion? Again, that's up to the states to define as and how they see fit. Although, what's interesting there is their definition of an insult to religion is clearly doesn't include the state. And just to give you, I think, a great example of this, Hassan Rahimpur Azadi, who's a member of the Supreme Council for the Cultural Revolution, that's a great body to be a member of, said on July the 20th, 2007, that Christianity was a reeking corpse on which you have to constantly pour eau de cologne and perfume and wash it in order to keep it clean. I'm not aware that this gentleman is being prosecuted under Article 513. And again, if you act against what's called national security, and again, that's a wonderfully vague term, you can face trial and imprisonment. And one of the ways in which you're harassed is that the regime imposes some really exorbitant bail demands. And again, here's an example of Mohammed Sadiq Kabourvad, who's an Iranian Kurd who was arrested about 10 months ago for setting up the Committee for the Defense of Human Rights in Kurdistan, Iranian Kurdistan, and he's been imprisoned because his bail was set at around $150,000. And this is a country which, what, GDP per capita is about $2,000 to $3,000. And he spent, of those 10 months, 4.5 months in solitary confinement. Let me just quickly touch on the cases of the 4 Iranian Americans, because I think this was very interesting, their imprisonment last year. Again, the regime excuse was, well, you know, involved with the civil society programs, possibly with the United States, there's something dodgy going on there. But I think actually, contrary to the contention that they paid a price for the alleged, for example, US refusal to talk to the Iranian regime and the regime's paranoia, I think what's interesting about these 4 Iranian Americans is that certainly 3 of them were advocates, very open advocates of dialogue between Iran and the United States. And the 4th, as you know, a journalist working for US government-funded radio station. So what I think the regime was indicating to us with their imprisonment was that it opposes genuine civil society development, and it opposes the very sort of dialogue that civil society development entails. This wasn't about what the US is doing, it's about what Iranians could do if they had the chance. Let me just talk quickly about that key element, that state of uncertainty. Yes, it comes from dysfunction in the regime. Yes, it comes from inefficiency. Yes, there's a degree of the right hand and the left hand not knowing what the other is doing. But it's a deliberate aspect as well, I think. And why is it deliberate? Because, as you know, again, you just have to look at other repressive and authoritarian states. Having people who jail people is a prerequisite of being an authoritarian state and terribly handy. But having people who will mentally jail themselves is even better, and it's not only a labour-saving device, but it's a technique that these regimes use. And I think this was wonderfully summed up just this week, on April the 28th, by the Minister of Culture. You probably saw this quote, Mohammed Hussein Safar Harandi, who, responding to the complaint of the Tehran Publishers Association that they don't know where they stand, said, "This is what we ask publishers and writers. You are aware of the vetting code, so censor pages which are likely to create a dispute." That's the Minister of Culture saying very openly, you repress yourself. You censor yourself. And, of course, if you don't, the regime will do it for you. So, what this means, unfortunately, is that Iranian civil society is under very deep threat and under very severe threat. This does not mean, let me be clear, that Iranians are not interested in basic freedoms. And it does not mean that the regime has successfully intimidated them and bought them off, as some people would argue. What it does mean, however, is that we should be supporting, I would argue, and that's my job, Iranian civil society to survive the threat and the attempt by the state to regress Iranian civil society. Thank you.
Okay, so I'll take about 15 minutes for Q&A, and then we'll have a brief coffee break after that. We'll be on schedule. There's sort of an extra 15 minutes built into the morning sessions, so we'll be okay. Does anybody have any questions or comments for the panel?
Maybe somewhere on the program. What I'm interested in is where does Ahmadinejad get his support regarding, from the point of view of the Ayatollah? The Ayatollah is completely behind the policies of the government. What is the nature of the mentality of the Ayatollahs? Are they medieval in mentality? It's something that interests me very much in the modern world. Are we dealing with a medieval mindset regarding the world, the culture?
Let me try. When you go to Tehran or to any other city in Iran, you see the people, when you see the stores, when you see the buildings, you don't see that medieval life. It's a modern society, Iran. Iran has moved from a society of even Paykan, an Iranian famous car under the Shah, into a society of what I call Peugeot, the French car. I mean, now Paykan has been replaced by Peugeot.
That picture is something inspired.
I'm sorry? Is what? Okay, yeah, but
The Paykan is Hilman.
yeah, I know, I did. But I'm saying from Hendelman we have moved to Peugeot, which is a better car and more expensive. The point is, the buildings in Tehran are more modern than they used to be. The people are more educated. The society is quite modern. Iran is not a traditional, backward, theocratic society. As I said, the social base of the society is very dynamic, forward-looking, very expecting, progressive, global, and so on. But the superstructure of politics is the problem. Now, the good news is that the superstructure hasn't really been able to impose, in the last analysis, its will on the general society. The society is going its own way. What has happened, however, that the society is playing a game with the political society to survive. That is, it has two sort of existence. On the one hand, it has this hidden existence of what really it wants to become. Like everybody drinks alcohol in most places in Tehran, as they used to do. But yeah, no, but at the same time, you don't see that served in the restaurants, in the hotels. Again, but the point here is, yes, there are people in the political society that are very backward, although not everybody, I would say. The political society does also have the modern thinking people, looking people, but the civil society certainly, and I don't say civil society because I think there is a misunderstanding of what that civil society means in Iran. I like to call it the social base of the society as opposed to civil. I mean, talk with the people as opposed to any particular organization, any political discourse, and so on. That is more likely. I think so. Therefore, yes, there are people like Misbah Yazdi, the Ayatollah Misbah Yazdi, who wanted to impose a theocracy that is 1400 years old on the people, but at the end of the day, they really aren't able to do it. Okay, so you do have this tremendous contradiction between the so-called tradition and modernity in Iran, okay, and in an old age struggle,
But it seems to me that over time the modernity is melting the tradition into itself. The civil society is melting the political society into itself as opposed to the other way around.
Just a comment about that. Iranian, majority of Iranian people, they ignore radical theologies, and they are living like the people in Western countries. But everything, because everything is criminal, they do that very secret. Everything. So we cannot say the majority of people, they are following radical clergies. But you're right. Radical clergies now are supporting Ahmadinejad and are supporting this view, because Ahmadinejad is symbol of one view in that political system. And they support Ahmadinejad, but it doesn't mean that Iranian people, they follow these clergy. And we do have some other clergies who are outside the political system. And they are not silent, and sometimes they are criticizing the political system and sometimes censorship, and they are arrested like secular people. And now somebody like Paivandi now is in prison, and he is a clergy who is criticizing the radical clergies all the time. And some other people like Yusufi Eshkabari, like Saeed, they lost their turban and their position as clergy. And because we do have a court, the name is the court, particularly for clergies, and when they say something against the political system and the policy of political system, they arrest them. So when there is no freedom of speech, even clergies who want to give a better interpretation of Islam, I don't mean that very, very good interpretation of Islam, but better interpretation of Islam, even they cannot work very hard in this case.
Excuse me.
Hang on. We're going to take two quick questions, Professor Menashri and Lloyd Fischler. Sid, you okay?
I think that this panel has shown the complexity of Iranian politics in a wonderful way, and mainly the two first speakers looking at different aspects, looking at the same picture, and they are both very knowledgeable, but each stresses something else in Iranian political system. Professor Amirahmadi stresses there is a power structure, and there is a constitution. And then we hear from Mrs. Carr that there is a power structure, but the selected people are supervising the elected. And in fact, there is limiting the expression of public opinion. I think that's the basic point in Iranian complexity, that the system doesn't allow a change. Now, there is a system, and then we take from the last speaker, a very interesting point that was given somehow not stressed, but I think it's important, that this regime knows how to use, how to learn from its own experience. What they have done between the elections to the Council of Experts in December 2006 and the parliamentary elections shows how brilliant they are and how shrewdly they run the country. But my specific question to Professor Amirahmadi is that having been recently in Iran and as a guest of Iran and meeting key people, is there any new sense that you came back from Iran from this trip that it was new to you or strengthened your views about Iran? What one can learn from this kind of visit to Iran, a new understanding of the dynamics of Iranian society, because as you mentioned, it's a dynamic society.
First off, I didn't go as a guest of the government. I paid my own ticket. I paid my own hotel bills, and
So also you sponsor.
What I was a sponsorship. I mean, is support. I mean, basically, I said was support, but that is because I couldn't go to Iran unless Ahmad had told me you know, in a writing that you can come, and he had written to certain institutions that this guy can come and don't bother him. But that was really the extent of my the sponsorship. Otherwise, I went my own. Now, the second, I believe it is, and let me put it this way, and this doesn't mean anything to anybody. The Iranian studies, unfortunately, okay, is experiencing, I would say, the kind of understanding that that is problematic, to say the least. There was a time when an expert on Iran would speak the language, that would have visited the country, have left the country, knows the history of the country, had studied the culture. The last 20-some years, Iranian experts, quote unquote, have become people who have never seen the country, who don't speak the language. They have no idea what's going on. So we have created a myth of that country. So one reason it is so important to go to the country is to see the reality. I think the biggest problem is the reality. What I saw after 10 years, actually, I was surprised that many of what I had in mind was wrong. That I thought, just like many, that civil society is dead, that there's a regime that has taken over everything, that there is factions all over, that the principalists are in place, that everything is just like it. That's not the case. I mean, you go, for example, I've been doing the election, and there are principalists, quote unquote, and the reformists running. So the people come, the candidates come to me, you know, because I was popular in my hometown. They would come to me for support, and I would say, okay, who is this guy? And my brother would say, he calls himself a principalist. How about that one? He calls himself a reformist. The people don't believe anymore that these guys are reformists or principalists. They really don't. That's extremely important to understand, that the factionalism that you see, the principalists of number 1 and 2, all the principalists in the country are 300 people. All the reformists in the country are about 250 people. I said very openly, I said it in Tehran, there are not more than that. Iranian people are not reformists or principalists of number 1 or 2 or that kind of stuff. That does not mean that Iranians don't want to reform, they don't want a democracy, they don't want a human rights. They do, but they don't put themselves into the categories that this political factions want them to be in. They refuse to be categorized as A, B, C. That's very important. What Iranians see, what you see in Iran is a society very dynamic that is building the political society itself, is forcing the political society to listen, although they may not have organization, they may not have a movement and so on. So I think the key to learn, okay, and that's a very important question, is that the reality in Iran is very different from what we hear from outside. Again, that does not mean that reality is more positive or more negative. It is different. At times I have seen that reality more negative than I have thought here, and at times I have also seen the reality more positive. But it is different from the perception of Iran that emerges in the media in this country. For example, let me give you one example. I thought, for example, Iran is a society where military security is in control. I went to Iran, I saw the one that is in control is not the military, it is the security. It is the information ministry that is in control, not Revolutionary Guard. There's a lot of misunderstanding or a lot of hype about Revolutionary Guard in Iran. Even the part of the Revolutionary Guard that we think is in control is actually in control because it is in intelligence. It is the intelligence, not the military, that is in control. That was really a surprise to me. Not that it didn't exist, not that they didn't know there, but the extent of their control was a surprise. So, the extent of this tremendous hype about Revolutionary Guard, it's a surprise. I didn't see that to be such a huge presence in the country controlling everything. In fact, there's a lot of myth about the Revolutionary Guard. When you go to Iran, you will see But the Revolutionary Guard is not really.
If I go to Iran, I can't go back.
I'm sorry?
If I go to Iran, I cannot come back to tell you.
That's a myth too. That's a myth too. I think you could go to Iran. I promise among all of these people that you go to Iran and return. You want to do it?
You help us.
You want to do it?
Me and
That is another myth. That's another myth.
I can go too.
There is another myth. And the myth is that you cannot go to Iran and come back. Some of us have that problem, but many really don't. And even those of us who have the problem can resolve the problem.
Okay. Any other questions?
Well, very interesting point that you made on base. Very good point. And I think you're absolutely right. And there's a very interesting paper that Steve Heidemann did for the Saban Center where I used to work until last week. And I know this because I edited it. And, the Saban Center at Brookings, Stephen Heidemann, is now at USIP, and did a very interesting paper on, I think it was called Upgrading Authoritarianism. And he looked at Arab countries, but I mean, the same lessons could be applied to Iran and the way in which regimes have learned to adapt to civil society development, to control it, to channel it, to create their own regime NGOs, to take the edges off when it looks like it may be getting out of control. And there are very interesting indications that these regimes are actually deliberately learning from each other. And certainly Iran is coordinating with other countries in the region, for sure, and the Iranian presence in terms of intelligence people harassing dissidents in neighbouring countries is certainly happening, and we know that from our experience. And I think another point I'd make in addition to the vigilantes, that para-state element that needs to be looked at, I think another element that needs to be looked at is the role of war veterans. I mean, war veterans, as we know, in post-war Europe, I say post-First World War Europe, war veterans in some countries played an extremely important, very negative role. Clearly that class of war veterans is very important in the Iranian state at the moment. As for the role of the Revolutionary Guard, well, opinion also varies on that, but clearly this organisation and certain sub-segments are very active, and not just active in Iran, it would appear that they're very active in Iraq as well as we've seen in recent years. So I wouldn't write the Revolutionary Guards off, and so the very fact that now in the electoral law they play a role in vetting candidates, I mean, that is actually a very interesting and important development.
So, Lloyd Fischler will have the last question, unfortunately, of this session, and there'll be coffee. You can discuss over coffee. So, Lloyd, quick question.
I'm just wondering how open or free is the Iranian economy, and if so, are there levels of corruption among the mullahs and the political class? And as a sidebar, how controlled or regulated is the internet?
There are two things about the Iranian economy you must understand. One, there is a formal Iranian economy. Everything that you have to understand Iran, you have to put it in formal and informal. Politics, economics, and everything else. Iranian economy, particularly after the revolution, has developed a very large informal sector. A sector that is hidden to everybody, including the government. One surprise I have always had is that how come that the economy, with that statistics that we see, survives and thrives, in fact. Well, the fact is, I don't know the number exactly, probably 50% of the Iranian economy is not reported anywhere. Think of like the bunyads, the foundations. They don't report to anybody, and they really are huge. I would say almost 20% of the economy is in that side.
because they don't pay tax.
They don't pay tax, they don't report, even report nothing. Second, a lot of Iran's agriculture is subsistence, still, reports nowhere. I would say 20-30% of Iran's foreign trade is underground. That is to say, the revolutionary foundations, ministries, the average people, between Dubai and Tehran, probably there are $5 billion of underground trade, from particularly of the American goods. I mean, you go to Tehran, everywhere you go, including in government offices, you have HPs all over. Litvak, where that comes from? American commodities are all over the country. You go to the stores, everywhere you go, you have all of this, what you call it, the designer shops, the designer things, you know, from Calvin Klein to I don't know whatever else. that's number one. So there is this informal part of the economy that you have to consider. Second, the biggest problem in the Iranian economy, aside from this informality, is mismanagement. It's tremendous mismanagement because the economy is also run on the basis of the political factionalism. Here is the principalists, here is the reformists. When I take over, I have my guys, and he has his guys, and therefore it is not based on meritocracy. It is based on ideological affiliation. Ahmadinejad, when he came to power, threw away everybody that had learned anything about the economy and brought his own people who have absolutely had no idea what's going on. Because it is important to have a person that is of your idea, that's a person who is a technocrat who knows what to do. So mismanagement and informality are the two key problems of the Iranian economy, and I don't believe they could be easily resolved by privatization of that kind of stuff.
I think Professor Amirahmadi ignored corruption, yeah?
Mismanagement is part of the corruption.
Yeah,
What I'm
mismanagement is something, yeah.
Oh, sorry.
Mismanagement is the root of corruption, but corruption is very serious in Iran, and we cannot ignore that. And corruption is coming from some foundation, like the foundation that he mentioned about that, because they don't care about the rule of law, and they don't pay tax to the government, and they don't give permission to even these representatives who are in parliament. They are not independent, but they don't give them permission to control their records. And when Majlis Shishon, sixth parliament, they ordered for that, I think Guardian Council vetoed that point, that something that passed from the Majlis, and then in some other institution they said Majlis cannot control economic institutions who are under control of supreme leader. So if you think we have to give these foundations, positive role for better situation economic in Iran, I don't know. We have to say that they are working, outside of the law, and they don't care about the rules and regulations about economy in Iran, even those regulations that we know that. And I like to hear your view about this kind of working of these foundations, because they are the root of corruption. Thank you.
Just very true. Again, I don't mean to say that corruption doesn't exist, but I really put it under the mismanagement category, but I think you were absolutely right in explaining it.
So I'd like to thank the panel very much for a wonderful presentation. So we're going to take a 10-minute break. There's coffee and drinks in the back, and we'll come back here in 10 minutes.